everyone, and thanks very much for joining us. We intend our guest, the Honorable David Pryor, absolutely no disrespect whatsoever if we make this the briefest of introductions, simply because we have a lifetime to cover, which is encompassed in the Senator's new autobiography, A Pryor Commitment. That may echo to some of you. And of course, this is an uncorrected advance proof which I'm holding, but I think the official publication date, Senator,
is the 15th of September.
Mid-September, yes, anyway. State representative. Well, first of all, up from journalism to state representative and member of the bar and United States House of Representative, Governor of Arkansas, United States Senator.
As they say, Steve,
and presidential
I've been on the
also.
Public dole for a long time. As
yeah,
they say,
I'm tempted to ask when you're going to get a good job.
When a good job comes available.
But it was a fascinating life.
I've had a great time, and boy, people have been so good to me and good to my family, and I just don't know many things I would have changed, I guess.
You grew up in small town South Arkansas, Camden, Arkansas, which was the small towns of Arkansas, many of them had a vigor then that may have, owing to shifts in population, may not be quite so noticeable now. No offense to Camden whatsoever, but the tempo was different.
The tempo was different.
The times were different.
The culture was different. Most people in our so-called urban cities, like Little Rock or Fort Smith or Fayetteville or now Rogers, Springdale, Bentonville, most of the people in our state, I have a feeling, I've not done a scientific survey or seen data on this, probably either grew up in a small town or their parents grew up in a small town. But there's a kinship of small town Arkansas and small town America that I think helps to bind us together as a people, even more so than the Razorbacks. But it helps to bind us together and gives us, I guess you would say, a common interest, a commonality of culture, and of looking at things, sizing up people, identifying the characters of the town. I know in Camden, we would walk into a store, Watts store, or Snow Hardware, or Morgan Hardware, and we'd pick out what we need. We'd just say, charge it, and walk out the door. We didn't have credit cards, and that's kind of the way the culture operated, and that's the kind of the way we worked. And if, I don't know, it was a very, very close-knit, really kind of a nurturing existence that I grew up in Camden.
And your mom and dad, both political figures in their own right, not always as candidates, but they were always central figures in that community. They were always engaged in the life of Camden.
Well, at one time, someone labeled my father, and he didn't like it a bit, got on the radio station KAMD and referred to my father in one of the political campaigns as Boss Pryor of Ouachita County. He did not like that a bit. And my mother really was probably he was so gregarious and so good with people, but my mother was probably more comfortable in politics than my dad, because my mother had worked in the courthouse. She had run for circuit clerk. She was the first woman in our state, I think, to ever have her name on the ballot. And her father and her grandfather were sheriffs of our county. And my father, in 1938, picked up the local newspaper and discovered that he was a candidate for sheriff of Ouachita County, because there was a clean sweep movement to knock out everyone who was in public office in the courthouse, and he was a part of that, and they had little brooms fixed up and wore on their lapels.
He got drafted by his pals.
He came in from Dallas County and Holly Springs, Arkansas, into Camden, and my mother and my dad married 3 or 4 years later after he moved there. But she was probably in her own skin, more comfortable with politics than he was at first. But he really got to be good in politics and very good in business.
Was there, can you look back and say there was a moment at a rally or wherever you were, maybe at a dinner table conversation, when it occurred to David Pryor, I kind of like this. Maybe I could do this.
Well, my dad was Chevrolet dealer. He first started working at the Ford place, and Mr. Word, Dr. Word that he worked for, became ill, and he figured out some way to let my father, who didn't have 2 nickels to rub together, to buy the Ford agency. It was during the Depression, so weren't many people trying to buy a car dealership during that time. And my father was very, very poor, and he bought the company and with the help of the bank across the street, and got in trouble, almost forfeited his company, but ended up owning the Ford business and the Chevrolet business. They made him dispose of one, and so he kept Chevrolet and gave up Ford. And but he became very good. But the Chevrolet place, as we called it, was right across from the courthouse, and it became the center and the hubbub of sort of political activity. And right across the alleyway, the Camden News, is where during the summers they would on election night, they would bring the election returns in cat-a-corner from the courthouse. They'd always stop there at the Camden News, and they'd count out the ballots in something like 31 townships, Red Hill and Frio and Chittister and Bearden and Ogemaw, all the little townships throughout the county. And on those hot, steamy, sultry nights, July and August, that's when we had elections then, primaries. We didn't have any Republicans really to speak of, so we didn't worry about the general election so much. But we had one Republican in town. His name was Skidmore Willis. That's another story. But I loved being around all of that. I loved seeing W.R. Chicken Holloman up there announce the winners and losers, and A.L. Brummelow, I think, had his guitar or his foxhorn or something. Winners or losers, he would toot his foxhorn, and it was sort of a party atmosphere. And when I was young, I would always love to go and stay at the Chevrolet place and hear my dad and all the candidates talk, and then go across the street, watch the elections returns come in, and whatever offices they may be for assessor or sheriff or governor or U.S. senator. I remember Bill Fulbright the first time I ever saw him. He drove his own car, and parked it there in front of us for a drugstore, walked over to the courthouse, made a speech. I was 10 years old, but I could point to this day exactly where he parked his car, because I was always fascinated with him and with what he stood for, his great ability, his great world vision, but I loved politics. Ben Laney, the governor of Arkansas, he became governor. We lived next door to there in Camden. So we grew up in a political environment. And as Dr. J.B. Jameson said, who brought me into this world, I hate to say it, 74 years ago, he says, David came out of his mother's womb asking the nurse for her vote. And so that was probably, I was just born into it and always have loved it.
You and a young lady named Barbara were married, and you created a newspaper there in Camden. And but there came a moment when you said, I got to decide whether I'm going to run for something, and that was state representative. And you decided that's when you took the big plunge, I guess. Is that fair to say?
Barbara and I had been married probably 2 years, and I went to my friend Bill Andrews, William S. Andrews, and I said, Bill, you're voting with Orville Faubus on every piece of legislation. You're 100% for Faubus. Now you ought to break away a little bit. I mean, this has got to be a new day. We've got to remove those shackles, and we've got to move on as a state and as a people, and you need to be more progressive. And he sort of dismissed my complaints and my suggestions, and he said, well, I've got to get along, and to go along, I've got to go along with the powers that be, and I'm gonna probably still vote for Faubus and help him in the legislature with his stuff. And I said, well, Bill, I just want to serve notice on you. If you continue doing that during the next legislative session, you're going to have an opponent, and that opponent's going to be me. And I gave him notice, and sure enough, he continued to vote for Faubus on everything that Faubus proposed. And surely enough, one day I walked over to the courthouse and paid my $25 and ran an ad in the local newspaper, and I was off and running. Barbara had never been involved in politics at that time to any extent. But she got involved. Not only did she get involved, but man, she was really, really good at politics. She could remember names that I'd forget all the time. She could remember names and places. She remembered things that I had long since forgotten. She remembered people that we knew in college that we should call and get them to come to Camden to help us in our campaign. She was really amazing. She made a remarkable transition into the political world from Fayetteville. Of course, she grew up in Fayetteville, but all of a sudden she was cast into that political world in South Arkansas, and sometimes it was pretty cutthroat. It was pretty rough sometimes, but she performed beautifully.
Yeah, but still, it was home. And I think you've got an excerpt or two that you would share with us from the book about the.
Well, here's the book, and Steve, I couldn't have done this book without Don Harrell.
Right.
Don and I grew up in Camden, just a few blocks apart. My mother and Lee Harrell and Don's father, Don Harrell, was the mayor, and my father was the sheriff, and Don was on our staff when I was in the governor's office and when I was in Washington, and Don is a fabulous writer, and he's kept a journal for 30 years. We relied on his journal a great deal. I've kept little pieces of journals and scribbles of notes, and we went to the University of Arkansas where my so-called, quote, papers, unquote, are in the special collections, thousands and thousands of 4,000 or 5,000 pictures we sifted through. We choose about 50 for the book. And but I could not have done it without Don. I make no pretense that I couldn't have gotten 5 pages done. He inspired me. We worked mostly in Fayetteville. And then he lives in New York. We would be on the phone every week, 2 or 3 times a week, talking about passages and trying to remember things. But when my dad was the sheriff, we lived right almost downtown in a little white house. And my grandmother lived with us. There were 4 children, my mother and dad, and my grandmother, Miss Aunt Nellie, as they called her. And but Mary, our cook, our wonderful cook, her name was Mary Elizabeth McFadden Cooper Hurd Wilburn, and she came every day from the day I was born for almost 30 years to help my mother. And they became fast, inseparable friends. But one of the things that I'll always remember is how Mary would get to our home so early and do all the cooking for the family. And while she was cooking for the family, she also cooked for the prisoners in the jail, which were about 4 blocks down the street. And I'll just kind of read a paragraph.
Please.
Every morning at 7 o'clock, just about, or 7:15, a man from the jail, he's a trustee named Biggie Young. Biggie seemed straight out of a Rialto movie. He was a large black man with a gold crown front tooth. He bore a huge forearm scar, the result, we were told, of a knife fight several years before. I'd never seen his muscles bulge like his. He could hold his arm parallel to the ground, letting me swing from it. Yet, though he always arrived in a crisp khaki shirt and pants that seemed totally pressed, he was always outwardly jovial, and yet I could see a sadness in the eyes of Biggie Young. We became very good friends, and he took the path from our kitchen back of the house, down Washington Street. Then he turned left, walking 3 blocks to the county jail. And many mornings I would walk with him, separated from the courthouse by an alley. And sometimes Biggie, when he let me walk with him, he would take me to let me help him feed the prisoners in the jail that had been prepared, the food prepared at our home. The jail was dark and dank. It smelled of an awful stink. And Biggie's belt held a ring with enormous iron keys, the only way to open the huge steel doors of the Ouachita County Jail. And so those were wonderful memories that I had of that particular time on West Washington Street, growing up, Biggie coming by to pick up the breakfast for the prisoners, and later then our family would gather and eat the same food. So,
That's one.
Yeah.
anecdote from a series, from a pattern of life that I think you acknowledge in the book shaped you. That there were powerful interracial friendship, deep and abiding interracial friendships in those days, but they would end at sundown. The white folks would go one way and the blacks would go another.
This is
Maybe
sad.
that's changed a little, but it was more.
This is sad, but it was so true. We had segregated schools. The African American population basically went to Lincoln. We went to Camden High School and Center Street and Cleveland Avenue schools, and there was a separation. However, and this, I want to be very careful how I say all this, but I go back to that fabulous movie, Driving Miss Daisy. And that's the sort of relationship my mother and Mary probably had, a very, very deep and abiding respect for one another. Also a respect and a love for each other's cultures. Mary appreciating and honoring my mother's culture and her environment, and mother honoring Mary's culture and her environment. Even by going to Mary's church many, many times and teaching Sunday school to Mary's friends in what we might call, I hate to call it that, the Black Presbyterian Church. And but there was a wonderful relationship we had, but that was not true throughout. That was a special relationship that was held together by years of bonding and understanding and sickness and deaths and births and everything that bonded our people together. Sad to say, it was not true universally.
Mid-60s, special election for Congress. The Honorable Orrin Harris steps aside, takes a federal judgeship. You run and you win. You arrive in Washington at a time of tumult that rarely have we seen in this country. I mean, you had civil rights. There was civil rights. There was the war in Vietnam. There was the environmental movement was getting its legs under. The women's movement was starting to gain traction. These were the days of rolling thunder, as I recall, in Vietnam, and Lyndon Johnson besieged on the one side by his generals, on the other side by his own party, some in his own party. Initiation by fire.
This was
for a young
hard time for, not only for this young congressman, this was a hard time for our country. It was a hard time for our state. Remember that our state in 1968 left the Democratic Party for the first time, voted for George Wallace, also for Winthrop Rockefeller and Bill Fulbright on the same day, which has baffled the political pundits for a long many years after that. But it was a hard time, and the racial riots in '68 and '9 after Martin Luther King and Robert Kennedy were killed. And honestly, it was about as tough a time as I've known our country to go through. I look back at that time with sometimes a sense of pride and sometimes a sense of frustration, that I did not sense the reality of the moment significantly to come forward and show greater leadership. I wish I had of. I wish I had seen the importance of the civil rights movement more so than I had seen. I also, and I had built up a lot of what you might call good political capital. And what's the use of having good political capital if you don't use it? And I could have used some of that political capital, and I could have been a leader to some greater extent in the civil rights movement, and I probably should have been more aggressive. Now, in 1968, I did vote to seat, and it was very controversial, and I voted to seat the integrated Mississippi delegation at the Democratic National Committee. I was on the Credential Committee, and that was a tough, hard vote to sit there. My district bordered the state of Mississippi. I got back to the U.S. House of Representatives shortly after that, a few weeks later, after the convention and in the fall, and none of the Mississippi delegation in the Congress would even speak to this traitor that they knew as David Pryor.
They had a lot of power, too.
They had a lot of power. Bill Calmer was chairman of the Rules Committee. Jamie Whitten was incoming, on the way to becoming chairman of the Appropriations Committee. But I kind of made up over the years with most of those individuals, Sonny Montgomery and some of the rest, kind of made up with them, and after years of healing, I got to be pretty good friends. Bill Commer, Congressman Commer, never did care for me after that, though, and ultimately he would get me back. I tell about that in the book. But Jamie Whitten came around. Sonny Montgomery was a friend, but I got along a little better with him. But it took a lot of work and a lot of soothing and healing, I guess, to get back with him.
1972 approaches. You call it the biggest political miscalculation of your life.
It was a miscalculation, but looking back, I asked the appropriations people, I said, okay, I'm on the appropriations committee. I went on there as a freshman. I've moved about 2 notches in seniority up. There were probably 45 people on the appropriations committee. When will I likely be chairman of the appropriations committee? So they did all kind of facts and figures and looked at the charts and death rates and who was what age, and they said, well, around 2000, you know, something like. Well, this was 72. So I came home, and Barbara and I started thinking about it, and I said, look, we've been doing this for 6 years. I'm running back and forth. I'm absent from the boys and you so much. I'm going back and forth almost every weekend from Washington to South Arkansas. I hit the Little Rock Airport. I take off from Pine Bluff and Dumas and Texarkana and wherever I'm going in the district. And I said, if we're going to do this, and if we're going to dedicate our lives to politics and government, let's do it in a way that is more meaningful. And she said, what do you mean? I said, well, I'm thinking about running for the U.S. Senate. And she said, whoa, is Senator McClellan not going to run? I said, well, I don't know. Well, we started thinking about this. The more we thought about it and the more the rumors spread that I was going to consider this race, the more people came and discouraged me from doing it. Odd things happen to young people, especially stubborn young people, I guess, or maybe a false sense of pride. I'm not sure which. But the more discouragement I got, the more I wanted the job. The more I said, I can climb that mountain. It may be the highest mountain around, but I think I can climb it. And I had Barbara's blessing and her help. She was at my side. And we tried it, and February the 19th, 1972, we went to Camden and announced at the Whiteside High School, junior high school, dining room packed with people, probably nearly 1,000 people there. And I was off and running against John L. McClellan in the primary. Well, I'll tell you what, he was a tough guy to run against. He was going to be chairman of the Appropriations Committee. Alan Ellender died just about during that campaign or right at the end of it. And he was the incoming chairman, people felt, of the Appropriations Committee. He had a lot of clout, but in addition to his clout, he had something else. A lot of politicians have clout, but they don't know how to use it. John L. McClellan knew how to use it, and he knew how to press those buttons and those levers of power, and boy, he was effective. And I know I got worried one time when I heard he bought, during the campaign, he was going up to Blanchard Springs, he bought a new set of tennis shoes, a pair of tennis shoes. And I said, uh-oh, he's getting younger, and he was in his mid-70s, I guess, at that time, late.
76,
76,
as I recall.
Okay. And he, as I say, he got younger during the campaign and I got older. But I lost the race, and it's a funny thing, again, about politics. People really, they watch how you lose. Not necessarily how you win, but they watch how you lose. And the night that I lost, June 13th, 1972, at the hotel when I made my concession speech to a couple of thousand people who were disappointed and crying and carrying on and weeping. They'd worked hard, they'd given everything they had. Somehow or another, that concession speech they considered to be magnanimous. And people would say, oh, if you'd have made that speech the whole time, you would have won that race. But anyway, that's the way it goes. But I had that speech and that evening when I got licked, so to speak, as people in Arkansas will do their young politicians from time to time. Dale Bumpers was defeated for the school board the first run. Bill Clinton defeated for Congress his first run for when he ran for second term as governor. I was spanked by the people and said, it's not quite your time yet. So I nursed my wounds and paid off my debts, and hopefully would find a space some way to come back into politics, not knowing that I would ever have that opportunity, because I truly feel that this was one of those times when I had lost a race that I should have won. It was in my grasp to win. I had consented to a debate which was unwise. I misjudged him during that debate. I was probably overly kind. People just like watching a boxing match. They want to see some blood on the floor. And I was probably over kind. He was
all of it was yours
aggressive.
in this case.
And I don't ever forget, man, he wore a white suit and white patent leather boots and I think a red tie, and he came charging out after this young 37-year-old challenger, and he finished me off, I guess you would say. And it was a 51-49 race. It was one of the classic political races of Arkansas. I can look back now and say it was classic. I didn't feel like it was classic that night when I accepted defeat, but 2 years later I was back in the fray, and as Willie Nelson said, back on the road again.
In fact, 2 terms as governor, 4 years, and that was followed by, you made it to the Senate for 18 years, and to our audience, fascinating 22 years extra in your political career, and even some service after that, and the book is A Pryor Commitment. You can read all about it in there. David Pryor, thanks very much for this time.
Thank you, Steve.